Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. The Show Me Institute is a free market think tank founded in 2005 and based in St. Louis, Missouri. It focuses on Missouri economic policy issues. The mission of the Show Me Institute is advancing liberty with responsibility by promoting market solutions for Missouri public policy. The president of the Show Me Institute is Rex Sinquefield. Our guest today is CEO Brenda Talent. Before joining the Show Me Institute, Brenda Talent served as counsel to the St. Louis law firm Bryan Cave. She's argued cases before the Missouri Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of Missouri and has litigated cases in the Missouri Administrative Hearings Commission, the U.S. Tax Court, and the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. As part of her tax practice, Mrs. Talent defended clients against the Internal Revenue Service and the Missouri Department of Revenue. Brenda Talent served as a captain in the United States Army Judge Advocate General Corps from January 1982 until October 1985. For much of that time, she was a commissioner on the Army Court of Military Review, the highest appellate court in the Army. She lives in Missouri for almost 25 years. She and her husband, Jim Talent, a former senator, live in St. Louis County. Brenda Talent, welcome to Conversation.
Good to be here, Lee.
So what's a nice tax lady like you doing in an organization like the Show Me Institute, which is policy-based?
Well, I think in large part it's because I care very much about what our state and where our state's going economically. And as a consequence, I had an opportunity to move from practicing tax law into running a think tank and dealing with public policy, and I jumped at the opportunity.
Did you get bored with taxes? Like most people?
Well, I like to say that I'm one of those good lawyers because I represented taxpayers contesting their tax bill with the government. And what happened over the years was the nature of the legal practice changed. And in my early years, it was pretty easy to litigate. It wasn't as costly. So when you had a case where you really were in the right, you could go ahead and pursue it and get the result that was right for your client. But as time went on, litigation costs became a lot more expensive. And as a consequence, you often were in the position where you had to tell your client, you know, it would make more economic sense for you to settle than to continue to litigate. And as you look at the public policies of our state and what we have in the way of taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, all of those things, it becomes a little tempting to get involved and try to change how that system operates.
It is a very complicated system, isn't it? I mean, the whole concept of the Internal Revenue Service used to be pretty straightforward when it was first formed, wasn't it?
Well, I would say that when I first began practicing, I felt like I knew a lot of areas of the law, and as time passed, people began to specialize. I mean, you would have people who specialize just in what you kind of call consolidated returns. And the focus of specialization became much more intense because it really was that complex. And I specialized, I mean, I did do federal litigation, but a lot of what I did was state litigation, which was a specialty in and of itself.
I didn't mean to get into a long tax discussion here, but I do want to ask this one question, because just in the news was this Burger King case, which I'm sure you've heard about, where they might be buying up a Canadian corporation and then making themselves a Canadian taxpayer,
right?
And that's something called, I believe, inversion.
Right.
Can you just explain to people what this is all about and why this is good or bad, or why the president thinks this is such a terrible thing?
Well, I think it's actually a rather simple concept, and one which we've wrestled with in the state of Missouri, and that is taxes matter. Taxes can affect behavior. Now, are they the sole determiner of where a company is located, or how a company operates, or how an individual chooses to live their life? No, there are a lot of variables that affect those choices. But taxes are one of the factors that will affect the choices that a company or an individual makes.
So is this, of course, for the United States, I guess they are planning to take and pay taxes to the country of Canada instead of to the country of the United States.
Because of where they'll be located, yes. They're seeing a tax advantage in becoming a Canadian company versus being a U.S. company.
And Canada's taxes, I imagine, are much lower than the total tax burden of the United States?
I would assume that's the calculation they made. I haven't looked at that in detail. But if you're operating internationally, there can be a lot of other consequences that you're taking into consideration, so that if you're generating revenue overseas, one of your questions is, can I bring that money back to my country of origin?
So let's bring this all back to Missouri now. So because I know the Show Me Institute is very much, as you just said, in the consequences of tax policy and whether businesses are going to locate in Missouri or remain located in Missouri. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and Lee, I'm going to say our mission is a lot broader than that. You know, I like to tell people that what we care about a number of things. We want entrepreneurs to be able to pursue their dreams, for parents to be able to direct the education and upbringing of their children, and for government policies in the state of Missouri to be ones that enhance freedom and liberty rather than just expanding government. So the economic growth of Missouri is an important issue for the citizens here and for the businesses that we attract. And of course, taxes and our economic climate is one of those key components. So we look at taxes and regulatory issues, both of which can reduce opportunities for individuals and companies. And we talk about what would be the best free market policies for the state and localities to implement in order to encourage that business growth.
Mm-hmm. I guess I did start you off too narrowly, so maybe we ought to back up a little bit and just talk about as I said at the beginning, this organization was founded in 2005.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. What was the thinking why it was needed?
Well, our founders, and that would be Crosby Kemper, Rex Sinquefield, and Professor Mike Podgorski, all got together and they just talked about the fact that in other states, and you can think of some fairly large ones, Goldwater in Arizona, Mackinac in Michigan, had think tanks that were focusing on free market policies that would help grow their states. There are national organizations, Cato and the Heritage Foundation, which do the same at the federal level. So these individuals got together and talked about the fact that there is really a vacuum in the state of Missouri. And wouldn't it be nice if we had a think tank that focused on exclusively Missouri policies? And that's how the idea of the Show Me Institute was born.
I always do a lot of research before we come out and talk so that we have something to talk about. But I found while I was doing some of the research that there were a number of organizations that had stuff on the web, and they were specifically talking about the Show Me Institute. And these three organizations that I wrote down here, something called SourceWatch.com, Progressive Missouri, and the Labor Tribune, all seem to feel that that you were like in some sort of a cabal. I'm not. You know, I'm actually summarizing what they said. This is not like I'm trying to intimate something that they said. They actually said things like notorious. They used terms like notorious Koch brothers, right-wingers. Of course, Mr. Sinquefield, they had a few things to say about him. Show Me is part of a much larger web of belief tanks called the State Policy Network. And they also mentioned something evil called the American Legislative Council, evil from their point of view. I also found it was interesting that when I was reading Progress Missouri and I went to the About section, that in talking about Show Me, they were talking about how you're like this cabal working with a bunch of other people. Then they said of themselves, we work as a communications team for the entire progressive community.
Right.
Which sounded to me like they're part of a left-wing cabal. So I thought oh yes, and oh boy, the State Policy Network, they pointed at, they gave Show Me $87,951.49 in 2007. Would that have been a big part of your budget then?
No, it wouldn't have. I can't either. Yeah, I can't even comment
I know you
on
weren't
whether the
there.
number is accurate. Yeah, I didn't join until 2010. But here's what I would say: these groups tend to go after personalities rather than the policies. I would
they were always talking about notorious.
But they're not
evil.
addressing the underlying substantive facts that we're presenting. And I can tell you part of what triggered this focus by these groups on us is the fact that we revealed that when you look at public pensions in the state of Missouri, and we only looked at the top 5, rather than having an unfunded liability of $11 billion, it was more like 54. And that's an obligation for
$54 billion. It's unfunded.
That's unfunded. And that's because our public sector pension plans use a higher discount rate. And what that means is they're projecting what they think their current assets will grow at, what rate. And ours are using an 8% growth rate. Whereas private pension plans, they have to use a more conservative growth rate, around 4%. And if you use that rate, you come up with a much larger unfunded liability.
I was going to say, what's the real rate? Which is nowhere near 4% even, isn't
Well,
it? I mean, it's
I don't
closer
know.
like 2 or...
Yeah, if you've looked at your investments, probably closer to that. But what was interesting was we're just highlighting the fact that this issue exists and that we do have an obligation. We've made a commitment to people who've worked, and we need to honor those commitments. So what are the best ways to do that? Well, one of the ways to do it is to move from having defined benefit plans to defined contributions.
Why don't you explain to people what those two terms mean?
Well, a defined benefit plan is one where you are promising individuals particular benefits. A defined contribution...
Like Social Security.
Like Social Security.
Okay.
Of course, we know what condition Social Security is in. But a defined contribution is one where the individual contributes a certain amount, the employer contributes a certain amount, and those investments are what those investments are. But there is no further obligation. And so that way you can really control what your liability will be in the future. Mm-hmm. And it's that discussion, and I call it a discussion, that gets them all upset. And rather than addressing the underlying issues, the underlying policy considerations, they have to attack you personally. It's a very interesting tactic that we see fairly commonly now, unfortunately.
There does seem to be, as you just said, I was very surprised at the tone of some of the things that I was reading and preparing for this. You know, words like notorious, or the assertion that somehow that people who would associate with any of the organizations that I've mentioned, Show Me, American Legislative Council, or the State Policy Network, are there to do harm to the working people of this nation.
It actually is something that is very offensive, because I don't go around, and most of the people I know and work with don't go around assuming bad motives for people. I think most people we know, whether you agree with them or disagree, on the spectrum of progressive to conservative, would really say they're coming at it from their philosophy, and it's from a motivation to, in fact, have greater opportunity, greater advancement in our state. And so why can't we presume goodwill by people? And again, why don't we address the arguments and the facts? Let's focus on those. If there's something wrong with the facts that we have, or if we're missing a crucial point, let's have a discussion about that. We don't have to bring in the personalities, because as we all know, it's very hard to determine what people's motives are. But from what I've observed, the people who are involved in trying to make a difference, who really believe in free markets, it's because what we've seen through the course of history is that that's what really has made a difference in people's lives. That fosters greater prosperity, greater creativity, and really makes our nation a better place. And that's why we're in it.
In a perfect world, how would Show Me Institute think that government would operate?
Well, I think we would say that, there are certain very crucial public services for the public good that government needs to satisfy. And some that come to mind are infrastructure issues, those types of things, where government is really looking at what is our proper role.
Policing functions.
And how can we best fill that role? Rather than being in a situation, which unfortunately I believe we are in now, where you see something and you go, well, that's a good idea. And then immediately after you've determined it's a good idea, the conclusion is, well, government should do it, rather than asking the first question, what is the proper role of government? And then there's the secondary question of allocation of resources. We have finite resources. We can't act like government has this blank paycheck or blank check where they can just write whatever amount they want to do whatever they want. We've seen in Missouri, for example, the growth of economic tax credits. And what is that? That's really a statement in my mind that our taxes are too high. So we've created this other mechanism, economic tax credits, which government officials can dole out to favored industries, but they're not giving it to all of the taxpayers, and that's inherently an unfair system.
I always thought the taxes were supposed to be, you have some idea of how much government's going to cost you in a year, and you're supposed to go and get enough revenue in order to make sure that the government can operate for that year. There's got to be a simpler way to be able to arrive at getting that money into the Treasury to pay the bills.
Well, I also think part of it is government defining what is their role, because it's too easy for them to say, well, we need this amount of money. Needs and wants are two different things, and I think oftentimes we get caught up in the wants rather than the needs. When you look at planning, it seems to me a simple proposition, again, to go through your priorities and make sure that you're prioritizing those things that are most crucial for the public good. And then make the case, if you do need additional revenue, make the case to the public transparently for what you need. The other thing that it always confounds me is the fact that if you grow the economy, if Missouri was thriving, if businesses were pouring into our borders, we would be generating a lot more revenue. So it's in everyone's interest that we grow the economy, that we be a state which attracts productive people who are contributing to that growth, because then our coffers will also grow.
Well, there are those who say that, holy cow, they just lowered some taxes, and we're going to have less revenue. Of course, that's based on a static model.
Right.
Explain to people what you think a dynamic model looks like, and just define the difference between a static model and this dynamic model.
Well, a static model is one where you just take a look at what the legal change will be. In this case, we have what I would consider a very modest decrease in our taxes. It's 0.5% over 5 years, but it doesn't begin until 2017. So we go from 6% to 5.5, and there are little safety mechanisms by which if revenue doesn't grow at a certain rate, then it won't decrease. So first of all, this is a very modest tax increase that we currently have in Missouri. But the static model is just looking at, well, if we cut our taxes by this amount, this is what we lose, without taking into account that you in fact might be generating more businesses which will be paying more in taxes, or that will be paying taxes, businesses that have never paid taxes before, that you'll encourage creativity on the part of individuals who will start businesses also. The dynamic model would take that into account.
That brings us all the way back to what I was talking about, Burger King and moving to Canada, because they're taking into account the cost of doing business in the United States versus the cost of doing business in Canada, and then making a business decision.
Correct.
It's not a moral decision, it's a business decision.
Well, one that'll benefit their employees and their shareholders.
Correct, but there are those who want to make it a much larger issue. How dare they not leave money in the United States? They're an American company. It's immoral of them to benefit from all of the. And how do you make that argument? They're benefiting from the roads. They're benefiting from the United States Army that protects them.
They'll still be paying taxes. It's not as if they're going to quit paying taxes on their revenue sources here in the U.S.
Okay, so you've got the same sort of idea. I should say, Show Me has a similar idea about Missouri, that if you make a tax structure that is more favorable to business, then you encourage them to move from wherever they are where the taxes are higher, into Missouri where the taxes are lower. And even though the tax rate's lower, you still have more revenue coming in because you have more organizations that are paying into the Treasury. Is
Right. That's a simplistic way of stating it. And the reason I use that word is because, of course, we've got many layers of tax. So let me just take one more step back.
Okay.
One of the things we talk about at Show Me when we're talking about taxes, and you know, when you talk about a community, the business climate is one issue, your schools are another, safety and security is still another. I look at it as sort of a stool with 3 legs on it that holds up a community. And then because you're attracting so many people, you build up this intellectual capital where people are engaged in these very dynamic exchanges, and so the economy grows. But from the economic standpoint, we as a state put more taxes on the production of income versus the consumption. And what I mean by that is when you tax people's productivity, you're creating a disincentive for production. So that's why we talk about the need for lower income taxes, no earnings tax, because that's taxing the means of production. Now, having said that, we do actually have a fairly significant sales tax burden because in the state of Missouri, it has been fairly easy to create targeted taxes through the sales tax mechanism. So we'll have dedicated taxes for conservation or the parks, et cetera, all through our sales tax. And we just had that recent ballot initiative where they wanted to dedicate part of the sale, create an additional sales tax for transportation. So that's part of the argument for the need for reducing taxes. The other thing I would say is as a state, we are competing with surrounding states. And surrounding states are looking at reducing their taxes on income. And as a consequence, we can lose businesses to those other states, or other states looking at us will say, you know, there are some other states in the area that are more favorable to us from a tax perspective.
What has Show Me done about trying to include unionized labor in their thinking process and trying to win them over to this argument? Because apparently unionized labor is very much opposed to some of the ideas that are espoused by the Show Me Institute. Our audience would be Missourians, so I wouldn't say we've targeted a particular group of people. And I would also say that when we talk about issues like pension reform, it makes it difficult for organized labor to embrace us. That doesn't mean that their membership doesn't embrace us, because again, we have a compelling story to tell based upon the facts, and the facts would say that a number of these organizations may be facing troubles down the road. So having said that, I would also say that I like to joke about the fact that we're an equal opportunity offender, in the sense that you may disagree with us on our position on pensions, but perhaps you'll agree with us on our position regarding education and the need for choice in our schools. Or perhaps you'll agree with us that the tax credit system that we have in the state of Missouri is out of control. And in fact, progressives do agree with us on that, and oftentimes we're both there saying this is a bad idea because you're picking and choosing winners and losers, and that's not the way for our government to function. Well, here in the last 5 minutes, can you just describe what your thoughts or your organization's thoughts about education and educational choice are, and how that's different than the traditional public school system?
Well, I think first of all, we'd say that you shouldn't think of public education as a neighborhood and a bricks and mortar building. We're in the 21st century now, and education is changing. And it's really more about what the child is receiving and how they're learning, rather than a locality or an institution. And I think that that's been one barrier that has been difficult for what I would call bureaucrats to overcome. But the other is that we've been wrestling with these issues regarding education in unaccredited school districts and poor performing schools for years. I mean, I remember when I was on the school board back in the 80s, we were dealing with these issues. We have lost generation after generation of children to schools that have been underperforming. And it is time for us to say enough is enough. And the answer, we've seen it in other states. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Other states have broadened educational choice for parents so that those parents can make the best educational decisions for their child. And that might mean that the child does some of their learning through a virtual website. Part of it might mean that they go to a private school. But we need to get beyond this discussion about we need to protect our local school and really talk about how are we going to educate our children? How are we going to provide them the access and the opportunity to learn that they deserve?
Mm-hmm. And on the other side, they propose things like Common Core and putting more money into the bricks and mortars, hiring more teachers. Last couple of minutes, why, from the perspective of the Show Me Institute, is perhaps, I don't know, using the term the wrong direction, but not the most efficient direction to go in?
Well, not the most efficient direction, because we do believe that the choices about education should be made at the lowest possible level, so at the local level, rather than having the federal government setting those standards. And by the way, some of the standards they're setting are less rigorous than the ones we already have. We also have years of testing, and if we switch over to Common Core, we got to start all over again, which is ridiculous. There was another part of your question that I sort of lost.
Well, I guess what I'm really concerned about is there just seems to be people who are more interested in taking money from the Treasury and putting into folks' pockets, as opposed to being concerned about what the children know at the end of the day.
Well, and actually, we've seen that throwing more money at education hasn't been the answer. Again, study after study has shown that. We need to be more creative. We need to be willing to have merit pay. Let's pay the good teachers well to keep them. Let's encourage people who wouldn't otherwise go into the teaching profession to do so. We need to begin looking at education the same way we look at other businesses. Introduce the free market and competition, and you will get better results.
I wish parents would take more of an interest in their children. Oftentimes I have found that there is like an attitude that, well, hey, that's not my responsibility. I send them off to schools. That's their responsibility.
Well, there needs to be a little bit of pushback too from the schools to say, you know what, this isn't our job. This is our job is very narrow and focused. Now, I will say, I think there has been a push by our culture to say, you schools take on more of the parenting responsibilities. And we need to say, no, that's not our job. Our job is to educate the children.
Well, that's about all the time we have today. We'll have to have you back another time and go into more detail about some of the papers that have been written by your staff members. Thank you very much for coming and being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Lee.
And I've been speaking with Brenda Talent. She is the CEO of the Show Me Institute, which is an organization it's in St. Louis. It's actually part of Missouri. They're studying Missouri policy issues, things that affect those of you who live in the state of Missouri, to try and make our state, just make sure that we can actually afford to do business as a state. I thank you very much, and oh yes, this is going to be uploaded to YouTube if you want to show your friends. Thank you.